They called it the Fat Cat when they first saw the silhouette in their intelligence briefings. Luftwaffe pilots gathered around grainy reconnaissance photographs in the spring of 1943, studying the newest American carrier fighter with the careful attention men give to machines that might kill them. The Grumman F6F Hellcat looked exactly like what German naval aviators expected from American design. It was big, heavy, and ungainly. Where German fighters emphasized agility and climb rate, this thing looked like it had been designed by engineers who valued brute force over finesse. Oberleutnant Werner Gehler, a veteran pilot who had flown combat missions over the North Sea and Atlantic convoys, examined the photographs at a briefing in Trondheim, Norway, in July 1943. The Hellcat's profile showed a thick fuselage, wide wings, and a radial engine cowling that seemed enormous compared to the sleek inline engines of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf 190. Gehler and his fellow pilots had flown against British Seafires and American Wildcats. They knew carrier fighters were typically inferior to land-based aircraft, compromised by the need for carrier operations, reinforced structures for catapult launches and arrested landings, folding wings, and naval equipment that added weight. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Hellcat fit perfectly into this understanding. It looked like a flying warehouse, solid and functional but not threatening. German intelligence reports estimated its performance based on appearance and known American design philosophy. They predicted moderate speed, poor maneuverability, and adequate armament. Nothing the experienced Luftwaffe pilots couldn't handle. What those pilots didn't know, what couldn't be determined from photographs and estimation, was that this ungainly-looking machine would become the deadliest naval fighter in history. By the time the war ended, Hellcats would be credited with destroying 5,163 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, accounting for nearly 75% of all American naval aviation victories. The ratio was devastating. For every Hellcat lost in aerial combat, American pilots shot down 19 enemy aircraft. But in 1943, as German pilots studied those first intelligence photographs, none of this was apparent. They saw what they expected to see, a typical American design that prioritized ruggedness and firepower over performance. They were confident. They were experienced. Many had hundreds of combat hours against the Royal Air Force and the Soviet Air Force. They had flown the Messerschmitt 109, arguably the finest fighter aircraft of the war's early years. They trusted their training, their equipment, and their assessment of enemy capabilities. They were about to discover how wrong those assessments could be. To understand why German pilots so completely misread the Hellcat, you have to understand the world they operated in and the assumptions they brought to every combat encounter. German naval aviation in 1943 existed in a state of permanent resource scarcity and strategic confusion. Unlike the British Royal Navy or the United States Navy, Germany had never developed a robust carrier aviation program. The Graf Zeppelin, Germany's only aircraft carrier, was never completed. Construction began in 1936 at Deutsche Werke in Kiel, but the project was plagued by inter-service rivalry between the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe, by changing specifications, and by the Reich's shifting strategic priorities. By 1943, the carrier lay abandoned in Gotenhafen, incomplete and useless. This meant that German naval aviators operated entirely from land bases. They flew modified, versions of fighters designed for continental warfare, not purpose-built naval aircraft. The primary aircraft for maritime operations over the Atlantic and Arctic was the Focke-Wulf 190, specifically variants like the FW-190A3 and A5 adapted for long-range missions. These were formidable aircraft in their original role as interceptors and ground attack fighters over Europe. The FW-190 featured a BMW 801 radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, giving it a maximum speed of approximately 408 miles per hour at altitude. It was heavily armed, typically carrying 4 MG 151 20mm cannons and 2 MG 17 7.92mm machine guns. German pilots flying these aircraft over the North Atlantic and Norwegian Sea had achieved considerable success against Allied convoy protection. They had engaged and sometimes defeated British carrier fighters like the Fairey Fulmar, the Hawker Sea Hurricane, both of which were indeed inferior to land-based fighters in performance. The Fulmar was slow, with a maximum speed of only 272 miles per hour. The Sea Hurricane, while more capable, was still a compromised design, adapting a land-based fighter for carrier operations without fully optimizing it for that role. These encounters reinforced a dangerous assumption in German naval aviation circles. The assumption was straightforward and seemed supported by evidence. Carrier-based fighters were inherently inferior to land-based aircraft. They had to be. The structural requirements for carrier operations, the need for folding wings, reinforced landing gear, and arrestor hooks all added weight. Weight reduced performance. Therefore, any carrier fighter would be slower, less maneuverable, and easier to defeat than a comparable land-based design. This logic was not entirely wrong. It was based on real engineering constraints and supported by combat experience. But it was incomplete. It failed to account for what could be achieved when a nation with vast industrial resources and advanced engineering capabilities decided to build a carrier fighter without accepting traditional compromises. The German pilots who flew over the cold waters of the North Atlantic in 1943 had internalized this worldview completely. They knew they were flying superior aircraft. They knew their training was excellent. Many were veterans of campaigns in France, Britain, and Russia. They had confidence born from experience and success. The aircraft those German pilots flew represented a specific design philosophy that had evolved through years of combat experience on the Eastern and Western fronts. German fighter design in the early 1940s emphasized certain characteristics above all others. Rate of climb was critical. German doctrine called for fighters to intercept enemy bombers at high altitude, which required rapid climb. Performance. The Messerschmitt Bf 100.9 could reach 32,800 feet in 17 minutes, an impressive performance by any standard. Maneuverability, particularly at high speed, was equally important. German pilots trained extensively in energy fighting tactics, using speed and altitude to control engagements. The FW-190 excelled at this, maintaining effectiveness at speeds where many Allied fighters became sluggish and unresponsive. Armament focused on heavy cannon capable of destroying bombers with short bursts. The 20mm MG 151 and 30mm Mk 108 cannons could tear apart a bomber's structure with just a few hits. These priorities reflected the enemies Germany faced over Europe. British heavy bombers like the Lancaster and Halifax required fighters that could reach them quickly at high altitude and destroy them efficiently with heavy weapons. Soviet aircraft in the East, while numerous, were often inferior in performance to German types, making German fighters dominant in most encounters through 1943. But these same priorities created blind spots in German assessment of enemy capabilities. German designers and pilots had relatively little experience with the kind of fighter combat that dominated the Pacific War. Prolonged engagements at medium altitudes where endurance, structural strength, and sustained firepower mattered as much as peak performance. The Hellcat was designed specifically for that environment. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation began work on the F6F in June 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, but after extensive consultation with Navy pilots who had observed early carrier war developments. The design team, led by Chief Engineer William Schwendler and Project Engineer Richard Hutton, studied combat reports from the Royal Navy's actions in the Mediterranean and from early encounters between Japanese and Chinese aircraft. They understood that carrier-fighter combat in the Pacific would be fundamentally different from fighter operations over Europe. Japanese fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0 emphasized extreme maneuverability and range, achieved by minimizing weight through thin armor and modest firepower. American pilots needed an aircraft that could survive hits, outlast opponents in extended combat, and deliver overwhelming firepower when opportunity arose. The Hellcat reflected these priorities in every aspect of its design. It was big because size allowed for heavy armament, substantial fuel capacity, and protective armor for the pilot. It was rugged because carrier operations and Pacific combat both demanded reliability and damage tolerance. It was fast enough and maneuverable enough, not the best in any single performance category but effective across the entire combat envelope. German intelligence officers examining those first photographs in 1943 saw the size and bulk. They calculated the weight and estimated the performance penalties. What they couldn't see from photographs was the careful engineering that made the Hellcat effective despite its appearance. They couldn't see the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that gave the heavy fighter a power-to-weight ratio comparable to smaller designs. They couldn't see the pilot armor, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the rugged structure that could absorb battle damage and keep flying. Most critically, they couldn't imagine that American industrial capacity would produce this aircraft in quantities that would overwhelm any opposition through sheer numerical superiority, backed by technical adequacy. The Grumman F6F Hellcat that entered service in January 1943 was a substantially different machine from what German intelligence predicted. The production aircraft measured 42 feet 10 inches long, with a wingspan of 42 feet 10 inches when wings were spread for flight. The wings folded upward along the fuselage for carrier storage, reducing the span to 16 feet 2 inches, allowing efficient use of limited hangar deck space. Empty weight was 9,238 pounds. Combat weight with full internal fuel, ammunition, and pilot reached 13,213 pounds, and maximum takeoff weight could reach 15,413 pounds with external ordnance. The heart of the aircraft was the Pratt & Whitney R2000 800-10 double Wasp 18-cylinder two-row radial engine. This power plant produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff and maintained 1,975 horsepower at 13,500 feet. The engine drove a three-bladed Hamilton Standard hydromatic constant-speed propeller with a diameter of 13 feet 1 inch. This combination gave the Hellcat a maximum speed of 376 miles per hour at 17,300 feet. Cruise speed was 168 miles per hour, providing excellent endurance for patrol and combat air patrol missions. Range was a critical advantage. With internal fuel capacity of 250 gallons, the Hellcat could fly 1,040 nautical miles, approximately 1,197 statute miles. With a 150-gallon drop tank, range extended to 1,530 nautical miles, or 1,760 statute miles. This endurance allowed Hellcats to escort strike packages deep into enemy territory, maintain combat air patrol over carrier task forces for extended periods, and pursue retreating enemy aircraft far from their bases. Climb rate was respectable rather than exceptional. The Hellcat could reach 10,000 feet in 5 minutes flat and 20,000 feet in 10.9 minutes. These figures were adequate, but not outstanding compared to the best land-based fighters. The FW-190A5, for comparison, could reach 20,000 feet in approximately 9 minutes under ideal conditions. But climb rate alone doesn't determine combat effectiveness. The Hellcats' armament was devastating by any standard. 6 Browning A&M 250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, provided firepower that could shred enemy aircraft. Each gun carried 400 rounds, giving the pilot 26 seconds of continuous fire. At 600 rounds per minute per gun, the combined rate of fire was 3,600 rounds per minute, 3,600 half-inch diameter projectiles tearing through the air when all guns fired simultaneously. The 50 caliber rounds themselves were formidable. Ball ammunition had a muzzle velocity of 2,810 feet per second. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate nearly an inch of armor plate at close range. The kinetic energy, delivered by 6 guns firing converged patterns, was sufficient to destroy any aircraft then flying. Hellcat pilots reported that 2-second bursts were typically adequate to destroy enemy fighters. Longer bursts could literally saw wings off enemy aircraft or detonate fuel tanks and ammunition. Protection for the pilot was substantial. Armor plate behind the pilot's seat provided protection from rear attacks. The seat itself incorporated additional armor. Bulletproof glass protected the pilot from frontal attacks. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fuel loss from small-caliber hits. The fuel system included carbon dioxide purging to reduce fire risk after battle damage. Every element of the design reflected lessons learned from early Pacific combat, where Japanese fighters had achieved devastating success against inadequately protected American aircraft. The structure was massively overbuilt by European standards. The airframe could withstand 9G positive and 4.5G negative, far exceeding the limits of most contemporary designs. This structural strength allowed aggressive combat maneuvering without risk of airframe failure. It also meant the aircraft could absorb substantial battle damage and continue flying. Multiple documented cases exist of Hellcats returning to carriers with large sections of wings or fuselage destroyed by enemy fire, holes large enough to crawl through, yet still capable of controlled flight and arrested landing. German pilots encountering this aircraft for the first time had no way to know these specifications from visual observation. They saw a large radial engine fighter that looked heavy and ungainly. They expected it to perform like the carrier fighters they had previously encountered, slower and less capable than their own land-based designs. The reality would prove devastatingly different. The first German encounters with Hellcats occurred not in the Pacific against Japanese forces, but in European waters, where Allied carriers provided air cover for convoys to the Soviet Union and supported operations along the Norwegian coast. Operation Leader in October 1943 brought American carriers into Norwegian waters for the first time. Task Group 22.4, built around the escort carrier USS Ranger, launched strikes against German shipping in Bodo Harbor on October 4th. Ranger's air group included Hellcats from Fighting Squadron 4, VF4, commanded by Lieutenant Commander W.M. Drain. These were among the first Hellcats to operate in European waters, and German coastal defense units were unprepared for what they represented. The strike launched at 400 hours, aircraft catapulting from Ranger's deck in darkness, forming up and proceeding toward the Norwegian coast. Fighter escort included 12 Hellcats flying top cover for the torpedo bombers and dive bombers attacking shipping targets. German radar stations detected the incoming raid and scrambled available fighters. These included FW-190A3 aircraft from Jagdgeschwader 5, JG5, the Luftwaffe unit responsible for northern Norway's defense. The German pilots climbed to intercept, confident in their aircraft and their experience. Most had flown dozens of combat missions. They expected to engage the slower, less capable carrier fighters they had encountered before. Lieutenant Junior Grade Leroy Harris, flying Hellcat No. 19 from VF-4, was at 18,000 feet when he spotted German fighters climbing toward the strike group. He radioed the sighting and led his division into position. The FW-190s continued climbing, apparently unaware of the Hellcats above them, until Harris dove on the formation. His first burst caught an FW-190 from the 7 o'clock high position, the ideal attack angle. 6 .50 caliber guns converged their fire on the German fighter's fuselage and wing route. The FW-190 came apart in the air. Pieces of wing and fuselage separated from the main structure. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled spin, trailing smoke and debris. The German pilot never had a chance to react. One moment he was climbing to intercept bombers, the next his aircraft was disintegrating around him. The other German pilots in the formation scattered, diving for speed and separation. One attempted to engage Harris's wingman, pulling into a climbing turn that should have given him an advantage. The FW-190 was known for its excellent roll rate and energy retention, but the Hellcat pilot didn't try to turn with him. He converted altitude to speed, dove past the German fighter, and then zoomed back up with enough energy to maintain position. This was not how carrier fighters were supposed to perform. The German pilot found himself unable to shake his pursuer, unable to gain the speed advantage he expected. When he tried to dive away, the Hellcat followed, matching his speed. When he tried to climb, the American fighter maintained position. Finally, the Hellcat pilot got a deflection shot as the German fighter crossed his nose. The burst was short, less than 2 seconds, but 6 guns firing 3,600 rounds per minute put enough projectiles into the air that several struck the FW-190's engine. The BMW 801 radial began smoking immediately. Oil sprayed across the windscreen, obscuring the pilot's vision. Engine temperature spiked as cooling was lost. The pilot had no choice but to disengage, diving toward the coast with his damaged fighter, trying to reach friendly territory before the engine seized completely. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. In that time, VF-4 Hellcats shot down 4 German fighters without loss. The bomber strike proceeded to target, destroyed shipping in Bodo Harbor, and returned to Ranger. The mission was considered a complete success. But for the German pilots who survived that engagement, something fundamental had changed. They had encountered a carrier fighter that performed like a frontline land-based aircraft. It was fast enough to catch them. It was maneuverable enough to stay with them in combat. It was rugged enough to absorb hits and keep fighting. And its firepower was overwhelming. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Reports from JG5 reached Luftwaffe Command describing the new American fighter. Intelligence officers updated their assessments. The Hellcat was more capable than predicted, but specific details about its performance remained unclear. Was this an exceptional example, perhaps flown by unusually skilled pilots? Or did all Hellcats perform at this level? The answers would come through subsequent encounters, each one confirming that German initial assessments had been dangerously wrong. Through late 1943 and into 1944, German naval aviation units faced Hellcats with increasing frequency over Arctic convoy routes. The Royal Navy operated American-built escort carriers providing air cover for convoys running to Murmansk and Archangel. These carriers embarked squadrons of Hellcats alongside British aircraft, creating a layered defence that German strike aircraft found increasingly difficult to penetrate. Convoy JW-55 departed Loch Ewe, Scotland on December 12, 1943, consisting of 19 merchant ships, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and 2 escort carriers, HMS Nirana and HMS Tracker. Weather was typical for Arctic winter operations: brutal cold, heavy seas, and limited daylight. German reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the convoy from a distance, reporting its position to strike units based in northern Norway. Kampfgeschwader 26, KG 26, received orders to attack the convoy with Junkers Ju-88 torpedo bombers. The attack force consisted of 18 Ju-88s escorted by 8 FW-190 fighters. They approached the convoy at low altitude on December 13th in the weak Arctic twilight. The escort carriers had maintained combat air patrol throughout daylight hours, rotating Hellcat sections to provide continuous coverage. When German aircraft appeared on radar, HMS Nirana launched additional fighters. 6 Hellcats from 804 Naval Air Squadron climbed to intercept. The German formation was experienced in anti-shipping attacks. They flew in tight coordination, torpedo bombers at wave-top height with fighter escort slightly higher, ready to engage defending fighters. This tactic had worked against previous convoys, where air defense was limited to a few Hurricanes or Wildcats. The German pilots expected to fight through the defenders, deliver their torpedoes, and escape before Allied fighters could inflict serious losses. Lieutenant Peter Hutton, commanding the Hellcat section, from HMS Nirana, led his flight into position ahead of the German formation. His orders were clear: stop the torpedo bombers before they reached launching range. The Hellcats dove from 12,000 feet, building speed to over 400 miles per hour. They struck the German formation from above and ahead, the worst possible angle for the escorts to defend. Hutton's division hit the FW-190s first, forcing them to turn and engage rather than protecting the bombers. 2 German fighters went down in the first pass, one with its engine destroyed by .50 caliber fire, the other with its fuselage literally sawed in half by sustained fire from 2 Hellcats converging their guns. The remaining FW-190s scattered, trying to reform. The torpedo bombers continued toward the convoy, now without effective fighter protection. The 2nd Hellcat Division, led by Sub-Lieutenant James Foster, went after the Ju-88s directly. The German bombers were vulnerable, loaded, with torpedoes that made them heavy and slow. Foster selected the lead aircraft and opened fire from dead astern at 300 yards. His 6 guns poured rounds into the Ju-88's fuselage and engines. The bomber caught fire immediately, both BMW engines trailing flame. It crashed into the sea before the crew could bail out. Foster's wingman engaged a 2nd bomber with similar results. The 3rd Hellcat in the division destroyed a 3rd Ju-88, then damaged a 4th badly enough that it turned back toward Norway, trailing smoke and losing altitude. Within 5 minutes of initial contact, the German attack had collapsed. 6 Ju-88s were destroyed outright, 3 more were damaged and forced to abort. The remaining bombers jettisoned their torpedoes and fled at maximum speed, pursued by Hellcats until fuel state forced the Allied fighters to break off and return to the carriers. Not a single torpedo reached the convoy. The German formation lost 9, aircraft total, 6 bombers and 3 fighters. No Hellcats were damaged. The entire engagement demonstrated what happened when purpose-built carrier fighters encountered opponents who expected them to be inferior. German after-action reports from surviving aircrew emphasized the Hellcats' speed, firepower, and the aggressiveness of Allied pilots. Recommendations included avoiding engagement with Hellcats when possible and conducting anti-shipping strikes only when fighter cover could be guaranteed in overwhelming numbers. But overwhelming numbers were precisely what Germany could not provide. Luftwaffe resources were stretched across multiple fronts. Fighter production prioritized defense of the Reich against American heavy bomber raids. Every FW-190 sent to Norway was one less aircraft available to intercept B-17 and B-24 formations over Germany. The strategic situation was deteriorating, and German naval aviation operated in an environment of permanent scarcity while facing opponents with seemingly unlimited resources and increasingly capable equipment. By the end of 1944, the operational reality of the Hellcat had become undeniable to German intelligence analysts, even if frontline pilots still harbored hopes that superior tactics or courage might overcome material disadvantages. The statistics told a story that no amount of propaganda could obscure. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had delivered 2,545 Hellcats by the end of 1943. Production accelerated dramatically in 1944, with an additional 6,477 aircraft delivered. By war's end, in August 1945, total Hellcat production reached 12,275 aircraft, including both F6F3 and F6F5 variants. This production rate was beyond anything Germany could match in carrier-capable fighters. Not that Germany had carriers to operate them from. For comparison, total FW-190 production across all variants, from 1941 through 1945, reached approximately 20,000 aircraft, but these were distributed across every theatre and role: fighter defence of Germany, ground attack on the Eastern Front, and limited maritime operations. German naval aviation received only a small fraction of total fighter production. The Hellcats' combat record in the Pacific Theatre, where the overwhelming majority served, established performance metrics that intelligence officers found difficult to credit. From its first combat deployment at Marcus Island on August 31, 1943, through the end of the war, Hellcats were officially credited with destroying 5,163 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. This figure represented 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories during the war. The kill-to-loss ratio was 19-1. For every Hellcat shot down in air combat, American pilots destroyed 19 enemy aircraft. These were not the performance figures of an inferior carrier fighter. These were the figures of a dominant weapons system operated by well-trained pilots with excellent tactical doctrine and overwhelming material support. German analysts studying these statistics from Japanese sources and from their own encounters in European waters had to confront an uncomfortable reality. American industrial capacity had produced a carrier fighter that matched or exceeded the performance of Germany's best land-based fighters in most combat-relevant metrics. The F6F5 variant, introduced in April 1944, featured a more powerful engine version, producing 2,200 horsepower and improved in detail refinements throughout. Maximum speed increased to 386 miles per hour. Rate of climb improved slightly, but more importantly, production quality remained consistently high across thousands of aircraft. This consistency was itself a form of superiority. German fighter production in 1944 and 45 suffered from increasingly poor quality control, as experienced workers were drafted into military service and replaced by forced labourers and hastily trained substitutes. Hellcats rolled off Grumman's Bethpage, New York production lines with mechanical reliability that allowed them to operate from carriers for months at a time with minimal maintenance. The R2800 engine was remarkably robust, capable of running with cylinder damage, oil leaks, and battle damage that would have grounded German aircraft. Navy maintenance crews could swap engines in hours rather than days. Spare parts were abundant, shipped to forward areas in quantities that seemed wasteful by German standards, but ensured high operational readiness rates. Lieutenant Commander Paul Kortz, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer assigned to evaluate Allied equipment, compiled a report in February 1945 based on interrogations of German pilots who had engaged Hellcats and on technical analysis of American aviation publications captured through intelligence channels. His conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The Hellcat represented a fundamental shift in carrier aviation design philosophy. Rather than accepting performance compromises for carrier compatibility, American engineers had built an aircraft that met carrier operational requirements while matching land-based fighter performance in critical areas. Courts noted that the Hellcat's size and weight, the very characteristics German pilots had initially mocked, were actually sources of strength. The large fuselage accommodated fuel for long-range missions, ammunition for sustained combat, armor for pilot protection, and rugged structure for damage tolerance. The powerful engine overcame the weight penalty, providing adequate performance across the entire combat envelope. The 650 caliber guns delivered firepower sufficient to destroy any target with short bursts, conserving ammunition while ensuring kills. His report recommended that German fighter design incorporate similar principles: heavy armament, pilot protection, and structural ruggedness, even at the cost of some peak performance. But by February 1945, such recommendations were irrelevant. Germany no longer had the resources, industrial capacity, or time to develop new fighter designs. The war was entering its final months, and Germany's aviation industry was collapsing under the combined weight of bombing campaigns, fuel shortages, and the loss of territories containing critical raw materials. The statistical superiority of the Hellcat translated into psychological impact on German pilots who faced it in combat. Surviving German aviators who flew against Hellcats in European waters provided accounts that reveal the progression from confidence to respect to reluctant acceptance of material inferiority. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Neumann, a pilot with JG5, who survived 3 encounters with Hellcats between October 1943 and March 1944, described his experiences in post-war interviews. His first encounter during Operation Leader came as a complete surprise. He had been briefed that American carrier fighters were inferior, slower, and less maneuverable than his FW-190. When the Hellcats dove on his formation from above, Neumann's immediate reaction was disbelief. The American fighters were too fast, too aggressive. He attempted a standard defensive break, rolling into the attack to force an overshoot. The Hellcat pilot followed through the roll, maintaining position, and fired a burst that struck Neumann's starboard wing. Neumann pushed his engine to emergency power and dove for the deck, using his FW-190's excellent dive performance to escape. He made it back to base with significant wing damage and a new understanding of what he faced. His second encounter came in December 1943, during anti-convoy operations. This time, Neumann was flying escort for Ju-88 torpedo bombers. The Hellcats appeared seemingly from nowhere, already in firing position before the German fighters could react. Neumann saw 2 bombers go down in flames in less than 30 seconds. He attempted to engage a Hellcat that was pursuing another German fighter, but couldn't get into position for a shot. The American pilot saw him coming, pulled into a high G turn that Neumann matched, then reversed suddenly. The Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio allowed it to maintain energy through the reversal. Neumann found himself defensive, bleeding energy, trying desperately to disengage. Only the intervention of his wingman, who fired a long-range burst that missed but forced the Hellcat pilot to break off, saved him. By his third encounter in March 1944, Neumann's confidence was gone. He saw Hellcats as the superior fighter in almost every category that mattered in actual combat. They were fast enough to control engagement timing. They were rugged enough to absorb hits that would have destroyed German fighters. Their firepower was devastating. Their pilots were aggressive and well-trained. And there were always more of them, fresh aircraft arriving from American carriers while German forces dwindled through attrition and lack of replacements. Neumann survived the war and returned to civilian life. In interviews conducted in the 1970s and 80s, he was frank about his experiences. The Hellcat had shattered his illusions about German technical superiority. He had been taught that German engineering was the finest in the world, that German fighters were unmatched, that Allied equipment was inferior in quality, if not quantity. Combat against Hellcats proved those teachings were propaganda, not reality. American engineers had built a better fighter for carrier operations, and American industry produced it in quantities that made German numerical calculations irrelevant. Other German pilots reported similar experiences. The pattern was consistent across different encounters and different locations. Initial contact brought surprise at the Hellcat's performance. Subsequent encounters brought grudging respect. Extended exposure brought the depressing realization that Germany was fighting enemies who could outproduce and, in key weapons categories, out-engineer German industry. The psychological impact extended beyond individual pilots to unit morale. Fighter units assigned to maritime operations knew they were facing increasingly capable opponents with increasingly obsolete equipment and decreasing support. Fuel shortages meant reduced training time for new pilots. Spare parts shortages meant lower operational readiness. The best pilots were transferred to Reich defense duties, leaving less experienced aviators to face Hellcats and other Allied fighters over the North Atlantic and Arctic waters. By early 1945, German maritime aviation existed primarily on paper. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Those that did fly faced Allied fighters in such overwhelming numbers that survival, not victory, became the only realistic objective. The fat cat that German pilots had dismissed in 1943 had proven to be one of the most lethal fighters of the war, and German naval aviation had paid a heavy price for underestimating it. The story of German encounters with the Hellcat encapsulates broader truths about World War II that extend far beyond any single aircraft or engagement. It reveals how initial assessments based on appearance and assumption can be catastrophically wrong when they fail to account for the full complexity of modern weapons systems. The Hellcat looked ungainly because it was designed to different priorities than German fighters. It was big because American engineers had the industrial capacity to build big fighters, and the tactical requirements demanded range, firepower, and protection. It was heavy because protection and capability mattered more than minimizing weight. German pilots and intelligence officers made the fatal error of judging the Hellcat by their own design priorities rather than understanding it within its intended operational context. They saw a carrier fighter and assumed it would perform like the carrier fighters they had previously encountered, inferior compromises necessitated by naval operations. They failed to grasp that American engineering had eliminated the compromises through brute force application of industrial capacity and technical sophistication. The result was a fighter that could operate from carriers while matching land-based fighters in combat effectiveness. The broader lesson extends to understanding why Germany lost the war. Superior training, tactical innovation, and fighting spirit, all qualities German forces, possessed in abundance, could not overcome fundamental material disadvantages. When one side can produce 12,000 high-quality fighters while the other struggles to maintain operational readiness of a few hundred aircraft spread across multiple fronts, the outcome is predetermined. When one side can afford to make their fighters big, heavy, and rugged because they have the industrial capacity to build powerful engines and the resources to fuel them, while the other side must optimize every gram of weight and every liter of fuel, the qualitative gap compounds the quantitative disparity. The 5,163 victories credited to Hellcat pilots were not achieved primarily against German aircraft. The vast majority came in the Pacific against Japanese forces. But those victories, and the overwhelming dominance they represented, were achieved by the same aircraft that German pilots encountered in European waters. The same design philosophy, the same engineering decisions, the same industrial capacity that made the Hellcat dominant in the Pacific also made it superior in the limited encounters it had with German forces in the Atlantic and Arctic. For the German pilots who flew against Hellcats and survived to war's end, the experience was educational in the harshest possible way. They learned that their understanding of carrier aviation was obsolete. They learned that American industrial capacity could produce weapons that matched or exceeded German equivalents across multiple categories. They learned that the confident dismissal of Allied equipment as inferior was propaganda designed to maintain morale rather than accurate assessment of enemy capabilities. Most painfully, they learned these lessons too late to change the outcome. The Hellcat continued in service after World War II, flying with the U.S. Navy through the late 1940s and with foreign air forces into the 1960s. Its combat record remained unmatched by any other American carrier fighter. The aircraft that German pilots called Fat Cat in mockery became aluminum tank in respect among those who flew against it and survived. It represented not just a successful fighter design but a vindication of the American approach to military aviation, combining adequate performance with overwhelming numbers, mechanical reliability with devastating firepower, and pilot protection with operational flexibility. When the war ended in May 1945 in Europe and August 1945 in the Pacific, thousands of Hellcats remained in service. Many were scrapped as surplus, their usefulness ended with peace. Others continued flying, training a new generation of naval aviators or serving with allied nations rebuilding their forces. But the legacy of the Hellcat extended beyond the aircraft themselves. It established principles of carrier fighter design that influenced subsequent generations of naval aircraft. Protection matters. Range matters. Reliability matters. And industrial capacity to produce capable aircraft in overwhelming numbers matters more than peak performance in any single category. The German pilots who dismissed the Hellcat in 1943 based on its appearance learned these lessons in the most direct way possible, through combat against an opponent they had underestimated. Their initial confidence, based on years of success against inferior opponents, proved to be a liability when they faced enemies who matched them in skill and exceeded them in equipment. The Fat Cat had teeth, and those teeth were sharp enough to help achieve aerial dominance in the largest naval war in history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.